Imagine being forced to fight in a war you didn't believe in, knowing that refusing orders could mean humiliation, torture, or even death. For German soldiers during World War II, this was a grim reality. While today's militaries emphasize individual rights and moral conscience, the Nazi regime crushed any hint of dissent with brutal efficiency. This is the chilling story of the soldiers who dared to say no, and the terrifying price they paid. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, he demanded absolute loyalty from every member of the German military. Soldiers were expected to fight without question, die for the cause, and uphold the ideals of the Third Reich. The Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces, was not just a military. It was an extension of Hitler's ideological vision. Any sign of weakness, hesitation, or defiance was seen as treason. But not all soldiers were willing to comply. Some were disillusioned by the horrors of war. Others were morally opposed to the Nazi regime, and a few simply couldn't bear the psychological toll. Yet, in a totalitarian state, there was no room for dissent. Those who refused to fight faced a system designed to crush them. At the heart of this system was the feared Felgericht, the Nazi military court. These courts were not interested in fair trials or understanding a soldier's reason for refusing to fight. Their sole purpose was to uphold discipline by making examples of those who dared to defy orders. Desertion was one of the most common offenses. If you were accused of desertion, your fate was almost certainly sealed. The verdict was almost always guilty, and the punishment was usually death. Charges like Verkraftssetzung, meaning undermining military morale, carried severe penalties, including imprisonment, forced labor, or execution. As the war dragged on and the tide turned against Germany, thousands of soldiers attempted to flee, but the consequences were dire. Deserters were hunted down, publicly humiliated, and often executed in front of their comrades to instill fear. Even those who simply expressed doubt about the war effort could be branded as traitors. The punishments meted out to these soldiers were designed to be as brutal as they were public. Execution was the most severe penalty for soldiers accused of desertion, cowardice, or undermining military morale. The Nazi regime executed an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German soldiers during World War II. These executions were often carried out by firing squads, with fellow soldiers forced to witness them as a warning. In some cases, the executions were public, meant to humiliate the condemned and deter others. For example, in 1944, a soldier named Henrik Kästner was executed for desertion after he fled the Eastern Front. His death was announced to his unit as a lesson in loyalty. Families of the executed were sometimes billed for the cost of the bullets used, adding insult to injury. Soldiers who were not executed were often sent to penal battalions, where they endured brutal conditions and faced near certain death. These units were assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as cleaning minefields, fighting on the front lines, or performing hard labor under enemy fire. Penal battalions were essentially a death sentence. Soldiers received minimal training, inadequate equipment, and no medical care. Survivors of these units were rare, as they were often sent on missions. During the Battle of Stalingrad, for example, penal battalions were used to hold the front lines against overwhelming Soviet forces. Humiliation was another tactic used to break the spirit of soldiers who resisted. Those accused of cowardice or desertion were often forced to wear signs labeling them as traitors or cowards. They were paraded in front of their units, stripped of their ranks, and subjected to verbal and physical abuse. In some cases, soldiers were forced to dig their own graves before being executed, adding psychological torment to their final moments. This public shaming was intended to deter others from following their examples and to reinforce that disobedience would not be tolerated. Some soldiers were sent to concentration camps, where they were treated as traitors and subjected to the same brutal conditions as political prisoners and Jews. These soldiers were often forced to perform hard labor, such as building infrastructure for the Nazi war effort or working in munitions factories. Life in the camps was marked by starvation, disease, and constant abuse. Many soldiers did not survive their imprisonment. For instance, soldiers who were accused of undermining morale were often sent to camps like Dachau or Buchenwald, where they were worked to death or executed. In a particularly cruel twist, some soldiers were forced to participate in the executions of their comrades. This was done to break their morale and ensure their compliance with the regime. Soldiers who refused risked being accused of the same crimes as those they were ordered to kill. During the later stages of the war, as desertions increased, entire units were sometimes forced to witness or participate in executions. This created a culture of fear and mistrust within the ranks, pitting soldiers against one another. Psychological torture was yet another tool used to punish defiant soldiers. Those accused of crimes like cowardice were often isolated from their units, subjected to constant interrogation, and denied basic human rights. This isolation was designed to break their will and force them to confess to their crimes. Some soldiers were kept in solitary confinement for weeks or even months. They were deprived of food, water, and sleep, and subjected to relentless psychological pressure. Many confessed to crimes they did not commit simply to end the torture. Before we continue, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into history's most gripping stories. Behind these brutal punishments were the deeply human stories of soldiers torn between loyalty, fear, and conscience. Many struggled with the moral implications of fighting for a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities. Others were simply terrified of dying in a war they knew was already lost. Survivor testimonies reveal the psychological toll of living under such a system. One notable example is Dominik Reichert, a German soldier during World War I, born in 1893 in St. Ulrich, Alsace. Reichert was conscripted into the Imperial German Army. Over time, he became disillusioned with the war, and in 1918 made the courageous decision to desert, crossing over to French lines. Reichert survived and later documented his experiences in memoirs published posthumously in 1989. Another soldier who managed to escape execution later wrote, "We were trapped between the enemy and our own commanders. There was no way out, no mercy, no hope." His account paints a vivid picture of the horrors of war and the moral dilemmas soldiers faced. For others, resistance was more subtle. Some deliberately fired over the heads of enemy troops to avoid killing, while others sabotaged equipment or fed intelligence to the Allies. These acts were incredibly dangerous. If discovered, the punishment was immediate execution. Such stories remind us of the courage it took to resist, even in the face of certain death. After the war, the legacy of Nazi military justice stained Germany's history. Many of the judges and officers who presided over these trials were never held accountable. In recent years, however, there has been a growing movement to recognize the victims of these brutal punishments. Memorials have been erected, and some soldiers have been posthumously pardoned. This dark chapter serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism. It also raises important questions about the role of individual conscience in times of war. Were these soldiers cowards, or were they heroes who dared to resist a regime built on hatred and violence? Forced to choose between their lives and their principles, these men were caught in an impossible situation. Their courage and their suffering deserve to be remembered. If you found this episode eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other untold stories from history would you like us to explore? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.